Washington Journal continues.
Brad Bowman is an Army veteran, former Black Hawk pilot. Now he is senior director at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies for their Center on Military and Political Power. With us this morning to talk about the increasing conflict and tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Brad Bowman, welcome to Washington Journal.
Bill, thanks to you and C-SPAN for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Let's get right to the military part of this. And there's a lot of talk, obviously, about the numbers of Russian troops and how NATO might respond. But how well is Ukraine itself equipped militarily to respond to potential Russian incursion?
Thanks for that question. You know, when you compare the relative combat power of Ukraine versus Russia, there's really no comparison on most metrics of military power. But with that said, the Ukrainian military has significantly improved in recent years, including since the 2014 Russian invasion of Crimea. So if Vladimir Putin is sitting in Moscow thinking that a major invasion of Ukraine would be an easy walk in the park, if you will, I think he's probably mistaken.
You said in a recent op-ed that the Biden administration needs to step up its game in terms of delivering military help to Ukraine. Do you think they've done that?
You know, I wrote that on Friday, and I've seen, frankly, since then, not suggesting it's because of my op-ed necessarily, but since then we've seen several shipments arrive of these Javelin anti-tank missiles and launchers and other weapons, and I applaud those steps, but I worry that they're insufficient and they're certainly belated.
What do you think the capacity is of the Russians now? We reported of some 125,000 troops. What type of units, in your estimation, the type of data you're seeing, what potential type of invasion might they launch? A quick strike, a broad invasion into the country? What's your best sense?
You know, when we talk about a threat in the world of strategy, a threat is something that consists of both an ability to attack or threaten and the political will to do it. And what Moscow has been doing in the last few months is assembling extraordinary combat power all around Ukraine and including in occupied Crimea. And so, yes, we're between 100 to 125,000 combat and combat support and service support Russian troops on the Ukraine-Russia border, thousands of troops in Belarus, and many, many troops in, as I said, in Crimea, as well as an ability to come up via the Black Sea via amphibious warfare. So, you know, we saw a lot of equipment sent in advance. We're starting to see personnel falling in on that equipment. I don't think an invasion would necessarily come tomorrow, but it could come in a few weeks. And I think the period after the Olympics are over, when you have frozen terrain in late February, early March before the spring thaw, will be a particularly dangerous period. And you know, what form would an attack look like? I don't think anyone knows for sure, and anyone who suggests otherwise may be mistaken. Vladimir Putin may not even know. I think he's doing a bit of what former Secretary of State, the late George Shultz, talked about when he talked about the shadow of power on the negotiating table. He'd like to accomplish his objectives in Ukraine at the negotiating table if he can. Maybe he'll attempt a coup and some subversion and sabotage. He'd probably rather get his political objectives that way. But if he can't, he appears prepared. He'll have the means, if he wants to launch an invasion of Ukraine, which could take different forms. It could be missile strikes. It could be a one-pronged attack. It could be a multi-pronged attack. It could be along the south. It could be focused on Kyiv. It could take a number of forms.
You mentioned George Shultz, the current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, yesterday said basically the next move is Russia's in laying out in conversations and in dialogue with the Russians, which he didn't reveal all of, what the U.S., what NATO is looking for. The Russians responding to that this morning with a headline here in the New York Times saying that the U.S. response to its demands does not cause much cause for optimism. The Kremlin, they write that the Kremlin today warned that there was, quote, not much cause for optimism that the West would satisfy Russia's demands in the showdown over Ukraine, but that President Vladimir Putin would take his time to study the written responses that the United States and NATO submitted a day earlier before deciding how to proceed. Remind us again of the key diplomatic issues that are at stake here that Russia is seeking and the red lines, if you will, or the issues that the NATO and the U.S. is holding firm against?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a fundamental question and important for viewers to understand. Some may understand it, some may not. The core conflict here, as I see it, is a conflict between two worldviews. It's the worldview of Vladimir Putin of a might makes right model that says that I'm more powerful than you, Ukraine. I can tell you what to do. I can tell you what to do inside your country, and I can tell you with whom to associate. That's what John Kerry in 2014, after the Crimea invasion, called the 19th century model. Unfortunately, we're seeing a little bit of that here now in the 21st century. And on the other side of that are fundamental democratic principles that America at its best seeks to pursue, that are codified in the preamble to the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty. And that is the principles of self-determination, democracy, the rule of law, and international borders. And so the question for your viewers to consider as you're weighing where to come down on this is, do you support a might makes right model? Do you believe Putin should be able to tell his neighbors what they're going to do and with whom they're going to associate? Or do you believe the people of Ukraine and their duly elected government in Kyiv have that right? That's, to me, the fundamental choice and conflict here.
Brad Bowman is our guest. We're talking about the Russian-Ukraine tensions and the potential for conflict there. The lines are for Democrats 2027-488-8000, for Republicans 2027-488-8001, and for all others 2027-488-8002. We'll mention you're an Army veteran. You're a former Black Hawk pilot and assistant professor at West Point. When you heard the news about the president putting 8,500 U.S. troops on higher alert because of the situation, what do you think that purpose was, the president's purpose was?
I think that was a prudent step and an insufficient step. We have some units like the 82nd Airborne in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that tend to be always on a shorter recall. And the 101st Airborne, 101st Division and units like that. I think that's a prudent step. The spokesman at the Pentagon suggested that was to support the NATO reaction force. And as he responded to repeated questions from the Pentagon press, he really made clear that the kind of the activation of those troops was based on NATO's decision to activate the response force. And I would just hasten to add that we have a sovereign right, the president does, to send our troops where we like. And we have a Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who's an American military officer. So we can move U.S. forces in Europe around at our will, and we can deploy our forces into Europe at our will. And I support efforts to protect NATO, to honor our Article 5 commitment to protect NATO members. But there's the key point, right? Ukraine is not a NATO member, right? And Vladimir Putin's own actions in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Crimea, and what he's done with backing separatists in the Donbass since then are the most persuasive argument possible for the value of NATO membership. And so Putin complains about NATO expansion, and he complains about exercises and weapons near his borders, but his very aggression is the primary reason for that.
There are a couple articles this morning about the state of the Russian military and how it's advanced over the last couple of decades. Washington Post here, the headline, as it weighs action on Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia showcases its new military prowess, writing that when Russian forces rolled into neighboring Georgia in 2008, they carried the baggage of an outdated Soviet military, subpar communications, old equipment, and poor coordination. They even accidentally shot down their own planes. Nearly a decade and a half later, as the Kremlin considers mounting an equally overt invasion of neighboring Ukraine, the Russian military has advanced significantly, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has shown a willingness to use it to get his way in global affairs.
I think that assessment is essentially right. There's two dangers here, I think, when looking at Russia in general and also the Russian military in particular. One is to view them as 15 feet tall, as just unstoppable. That's not true. But there's also a danger of dismissing their capabilities. We're talking about, we're talking about 120,000 plus combat support and combat service support. We're talking tanks, we're talking artillery, we're talking advanced aircraft. They're moving in theater pieces like sophisticated missile defense and air defense. And so there is no question that Ukraine would have its hands full in dealing with a massive invasion from Putin. There's no question they are dramatically improved since both 2008 and 2014. And many Americans may not be tracking that Russia has been undertaking a massive military modernization effort, both of its conventional forces and its nuclear forces. And the conventional component of that is on display for all to see, really, right now in the assembling troops that continue, the number and capability of which continues to grow surrounding Ukraine.
We get to calls here momentarily with Brad Bowman in just a moment. I do want to relay this report from Jeff Bennett of NBC, who's tweeting this morning about the retiring Chief Justice Breyer, Supreme Court Justice Breyer. The president and Justice Breyer are set to appear together at the White House today as Breyer officially announces his retirement. A source familiar confirming a CNN report. We'll keep you posted on any coverage. Let's go to calls, though. Got lots of them here for Brad Bowman. We'll go first to Lake Orion, Michigan. And Jan, go ahead with your question or comment.
Good morning, sir. I understand the gentleman is a warrior, and all she knows is war. It's amazing that when Reagan agreed to stop the push towards Eastern Europe, NATOing and everything, he agreed with all that. And we've broken everything like that. We've broken all the agreements. And that this gentleman here, he probably gets a big pension or a big check from Raytheon or some other defense fund. See, what we got to do is have a constant Cold War to suck the money out of the taxpayer so that we can't do anything at home for the betterment of the American people. Now, all the business papers I read says Ukraine's bankrupt. Putin doesn't want the Ukraine. Putin is faced with the Cuban Missile Crisis 2022. Yeah, this is what it is. We're putting stuff on his border, threatening him. And you expect him to take it? It'd be like Putin putting missiles on Mexico and Canada.
All right, Jen, we'll hear from our guest, Brad Bowman.
No, thank you. Thanks for the call. You know, unfortunately, I think this caller's viewpoint is a little bit indicative of the policy debate we've seen in this country, where we go first at the ad hominem attacks rather than just considering the substance of what I'm saying. If you're wondering about our research institute's funding, we don't accept any money from foreign governments. Our funding is overwhelmingly from individual Americans and private foundations. And we do not have any current grants from defense contractors and haven't for a decade. You know, I served in the U.S. Army for 15 years. I worked in the U.S. Senate for 8 or 9 years. What I'm saying is based on what I think is best for our country. And I'm so glad this caller made that argument, because I think that's an argument that is common among many Americans, many good faith Americans. And I think it's flat wrong. I think it is a symptom of a malady we have in the United States, often called what H.R. McMaster, who's the chair of our board at FDD, Center on Military and Political Powers, calls strategic narcissism, where we Americans tend to sometimes assume that everything that happens in the world is a reaction to us. And I think it's important to remember that sometimes they're just authoritarian thugs who are going to take what they can get. They're like bullies on the playground. And sometimes they're just terrorists who want to kill us. And sometimes they're going to do that because they have agency and they have their own interests and objectives. And the question for us is, how do we want to respond? So what this gentleman, if we take his assertion to its natural conclusion, he would not support the NATO's open door policy, which allows countries to make a sovereign decision to join a collective defense arrangement, And the suggestion that NATO is Napoleon invading Russia, or NATO is Nazi Germany in World War II in terms of threat to Russia, it really is not credible and does not reflect the incredible restraint that NATO has shown. And again, the primary reason countries want to join NATO, the primary reason they're begging for American-supported weapons, is because of the aggression of Putin. Russia has legitimate interests, no doubt, like any state does, but that does not include the right to violate international borders and invade and occupy other countries.
Let's go to Samantha in Merrick, New York, on the independent line.
Hi, I thank you so much for taking my call. My question is, when is the truth going to come out that what's going on is really about asbestos and asbestos reform? Biden and Congress have tucked away in all their bills information regarding putting restrictions and regulation standards on whatever goes into potash, which ends up in our raw resource line, which ends up in our products. Hello?
Samantha, what's your question?
Yes. Okay. So when are we going to start talking about the truth about the asbestos and the asbestos reform bills
All right.
that are going?
That's a little bit off topic here. We'll go to Gardenia, California, and Anatoly on the Republican line.
Yes. Okay. So when are we going to start talking?
Yes.
Anatoly, make sure you please mute. You're feeding back on us. Please mute your television when you call in, or you're going to feed back like that. Linda in Tampa, Florida. Good morning, Democrats line.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. My question to him is: do you think it's time for us to show our strength and power? I think it's time because Putin to me is acting like Hitler. Who is he to tell somebody else they can't join NATO? So do you think it's time for us to show our strength and power?
Thank you for the call and thanks for the question. You know, the Biden administration has taken a number of positive steps. You know, I'm really trying to call balls and strikes here. I think it's good how they've assembled NATO allies and tried to create unity. They've told Putin that if he proceeds with an invasion, there would be unprecedented sanctions, that we might have to beef up U.S. military posture in Eastern Europe. You know, these are positive steps that I applaud. But the core constructive, respectful criticism that I've made in recently is that we want to do things before the invasion to try to prevent it in the first place. And to go to the previous caller, this is not because I want war. It's because, like most former soldiers, we want to avoid war. And we understand that the best way to avoid war is to have a military force and a military deterrent that no foreign adversary or aggressor wants to mess with. And so that's why I've focused on getting Ukraine, a beleaguered democracy threatened by an authoritarian bully, the means to defend itself. These are not weapons to invade Russia, of course. Anyone who knows things about these weapons understands that. You're not going to use an anti-tank missile in Ukraine to invade one of the greatest land powers in human history. This is simply raising the cost-benefit analysis for Putin, so he determines that it's not in his interest to pursue his political objectives with additional military aggression.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin took advantage or saw an advantage after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, saw an advantage to push onto the border of Ukraine and now into Belarus?
It's a welcome question, Bill. You know, I've thought about that, and I'm on the record repeatedly in criticizing the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan, a withdrawal that I view as timeline-based and ignoring conditions on the ground. And we once again have a Taliban al-Qaeda safe haven there, essentially like we did on September 11, 2001. And you know, it might seem like we're talking about Ukraine. Why are you bringing up Afghanistan? But that's kind of, in my experience, the way international relations and international security works, is that decision makers decide what they can get away with and what they're capable of. And you know, it's dangerous to get in the head of Vladimir Putin. I don't really want to be there. A lot of people are trying. I think he may not even know. But I think he takes the measure of American leaders, of American presidents, when he meets with them, when he talks to them, and makes assessments. You know, John McCain called Vladimir Putin the former KGB colonel. He's making assessments of the American president. Is he strong? Is he weak? What will he do when push comes to shove? And I don't have evidence for this, and it's essentially informed speculation, but I suspect that the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan, as well as other steps related to Nord Stream 2 and other things, may have left Vladimir Putin with a dangerous perception that there's some degree of weakness in the Biden administration that he could exploit, because he believes he has a weak hand that may be getting weaker in the short term and in the long term. And he's probably got an eye on history, and we know how he views the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how he'd like to reverse some of that.
Anthony is here in Washington, D.C. on the independent line.
Hello, am I on now?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay. This is my take. What he just finished saying right now, your guest, I totally support what he's saying, because the Trump supporters believe in the same mentality as Putin. They believe they think the same way as Putin. If there's a car accident in Indonesia right now, the Trump supporters will blame it on Biden. This is the way they think. So Trump, I believe that why do people want to join NATO? Because NATO doesn't attack any country. No, they join NATO because it's a peaceful defensive organization. That's why. So Putin was trying to test, and he miscalculated, and he's paying the price right now. The only way you get him to back down is showing strength, and that's what we're doing, showing strength. I guarantee you he's not going to go in now. The strength the U.S. and NATO has shown, he's thinking very seriously he's not going to go in. That's not going to happen.
All right, Anthony. Brad Bowman, though, do you think about the relationship of President Trump to NATO? Would it have made more sense for Putin at that point, sensing or a hesitancy on the U.S. side to support NATO? It would have seemed that, and yet President Biden, early in his administration, came out calling for strengthened international alliances, particularly with NATO.
You know, it's an interesting question, again, that I've contemplated. You know, I was serving as a national security advisor to a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during much of the Trump administration. And you know, I observed kind of an interesting dichotomy, if you will, during the Trump administration with respect to Russia. On one hand, you know, President Trump, former President Trump, said things that I found deeply troubling. I would highlight President Trump's comments standing aside Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, where he seemed to suggest that he trusted the word of Putin over our own intelligence community. I think that was one of the more embarrassing moments in American foreign policy history. But at the same time, the Trump administration took policies with respect to Russia that I think were incredibly strong. You know, the Obama administration did not want to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine. The Trump administration did. So, you know, I work at a nonpartisan institute, and we're proud of that. And we really try to call balls and strikes. So I see things in the Trump administration that I criticize and that I supported. And I see the same now in the Biden administration. I applaud their diplomatic efforts. I applaud much of what they're doing, but I would like to see additional weapons getting to our Ukrainian partners as soon as possible to prevent the war rather than dealing with the consequence, because we know deterrence is often cheaper than dealing with the consequences of a war we could have prevented.
A question for you from Brad on Twitter, who asks, did Putin get his bluff called by NATO and the U.S.?
I'm not sure about that. You know, I mentioned former Secretary of State, late George Shultz comments earlier. You know, Putin is, as is commonly the case, is pursuing a very shrewd strategy, right? He's veiling a lot of what he's doing in the guise of military exercises. And it's like, you know, who me? I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just doing military exercises. But those military exercises very quickly can become an invasion force. He knows it. He knows that we know it. And so he's, you know, in the best traditions of Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military leader and theorist, he understands that war is politics by other means, and he's seeing if he can get what he wants at the negotiating table. And again, what does he want? He wants a veto over the sovereign decisions of Ukraine regarding what they do in their own country and with whom they associate. And that's the questions for Americans. In the 21st century, not the 19th century, do we want to stand by the rule of law, national sovereignty, and self-determination? Or do we want to go back to a might makes right model? We've seen Putin do that twice, at least twice already. Georgia, Crimea, continuing in the Donbass. The question is, how is America and our allies going to respond? And I think our fundamental interests and national security principles and democratic principles are at stake.
Next up is Fred calling from Louisville in Kentucky. Hey there, Fred, Republican line. Go ahead.
I want to know, what do you think about who is the weakest president? You think Trump was, or do you think Biden is? Second question is, do you think if we stop the gas lines going from Russia to Germany would help? Thank you.
I didn't catch the second question there, Brad. First question was the weakest president between, I suppose, in the foreign policy realm and maybe on this issue, President Trump or President Biden.
You know, that's an interesting comparison. You know, let me say one thing that I think both presidents are getting right. I think former President Trump got right the severity of the threat from the Chinese Communist Party and started a national conversation that has led to the United States taking a wiser and stronger approach with respect to China. But I don't like how President Trump dismiss the value of our international partners. We'd be much more effective in confronting Beijing if former President Trump would have built consensus first with our G7 partners and with NATO and others, and then gone to Beijing and spoken with one voice. And that's where I think President Biden is a bit better. He understands the value of allies. He understands the value of a multilateral approach, not as a means, but as an end to objectives. But my criticism of the Biden administration is that they don't appreciate the value of hard power. You know, Vladimir Putin has given us a tough lesson in the value of hard power, and yet the Biden administration requested a defense budget recently that wouldn't even keep up with inflation at a time when the threats from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism are all worse than they were in 2018. Requesting a defense budget that doesn't even keep up with inflation, that is already at or near post-World War II lows in terms of GDP and percent of federal spending, I think that's fundamentally unwise. So I see things both to like and respectfully criticize in both administrations.
Let's see if we get a couple more calls before we wrap up. James in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Democrats line.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my call. We are dumping millions of dollars into protecting democracy in Ukraine from a Russian invasion, and yet our own country is under attack by its own people, supported by most Republicans. So why do we have to be the defender of democracy all over the world when our own democracy is so fragile and under attack that it's ready to crack?
I think that's an excellent question, which I welcome. I don't think we have a choice. We have to do both. We're not going to be strong abroad if we're not strong at home. We have to maintain and nurture our constitutional democratic republic here and the peaceful transfer of power and respect for the rule of law. And I think it's also in our interest to do that abroad where we can. You know, let's not forget that Europe produced 2 world wars in 30 years, both of which ended up forcing the United States to intervene, and hundreds of thousands of Americans ultimately died. Our most important trading partners are in Europe, and we have an important alliance there. And if this, and to make that very tangible for some of your listeners, if we see Putin's another invasion of Ukraine, you're going to see a massive spike in energy prices that you're going to see at the pump. So if you don't give a darn about the national security interests I'm talking about, or the democratic principles, then just stand by. And when this invasion happens, you're going to at least be paying for it at the pump. So I see national security interests, I see democratic principles, and I also see self-interest at work here. And they all mean to me that we should work with our allies to do all we can to deter additional aggression in Ukraine from Vladimir Putin.
You mentioned your experience on Capitol Hill. You served as a national security advisor to the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee. Those bodies, the House and Senate, out this week. When they return, they're supposed to get briefings from the White House on what's going on there. What sort of guidance do those members need, particularly in the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, on what's happening in Ukraine, rather? Yes, I advised 3 different members of those 2 committees over a period of about 9 years. And, you know, I would recommend that good faith members of both parties get with the Biden administration and really ask, you know, what more can we do to help Ukraine in the next few weeks? There's been some positive decisions by the Biden administration to permit allies, Baltic partners, to transfer American-provided weapons from their arsenals, the Baltic countries' arsenals, to Ukraine. I'm thinking of javelins and also man-pads, these shoulder-launched missiles to shoot at aircraft and drones and other things that Russia would employ. I would be interested to know what more we can do along those lines. Can those be expedited, right? You have to transfer them, you have to get them to the Ukrainians, and then you have to train them on them, and then you have to move it forward. And if you buy what I'm saying, that we could see an attack in late February, there's not a lot of time to waste. I would also encourage them to be asking about what additional weapons, Harpoon missiles, coastal defense missiles, electronic warfare, counter-drone, what more we could provide Ukraine, not to threaten Russia, don't buy the Kremlin talking point, but to help a beleaguered democracy defend itself against an authoritarian bully. Brad Bowman, Senior Director at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We appreciate the update this morning from you. Thanks for being here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.